The apron felt like a suit of armor, thin and starched, but armor all the same. Alara Vance tied the strings at her back, the familiar motion a small, steadying ritual in the nightly chaos of the gilded cage. Here, the air was thick with the scent of money, garlic, and expensive perfume. Conversations were a low, confident murmur, the soundtrack to lives she could only observe from the periphery. She moved between the dark mahogany tables, a ghost in a black uniform, her face a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. Her manager, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, watched her from his post near the kitchen. He thrived on finding faults. A water glass left empty for a minute too long. A fork not perfectly aligned. Each minor correction was a small exercise in power, a reminder of her place. Alara simply nodded, murmured an apology, and corrected the error. She had learned long ago that arguing was a waste of energy, and she needed to conserve every ounce of it. Her real life, the one that mattered, began after her shift ended. The 10 years she had spent planning were a fire banked low inside her, a patient, simmering heat that warmed her against the world's indifference. Tonight, the restaurant was particularly full. Laughter from a table of stockbrokers near the window felt sharp and loud. A woman draped in diamonds complained that her risotto was merely excellent, not transcendent. Alara offered to have it remade, her voice soft and even. The woman waved a dismissive hand, content now that she had made her point. Alara retreated, her spine straight, her hands steady as she cleared the plates. Inside, she felt the familiar bitter acid of resentment. She swallowed it down, just as she always did. It was fuel. Her fingers brushed against the small, hard shape beneath her uniform, tucked against her skin. The silver locket. It was her rosary, her anchor, its dented surface a map of her entire world. She could feel the faint floral engraving through the thin fabric of her shirt. It was the only thing she had left. Sometimes, in the quiet of her small apartment, she would open it and stare at the tiny, faded photograph inside. A little girl with wide, trusting eyes, her face pressed against her mother's cheek. The girl was a stranger to her now, a ghost from a life that had been stolen in a single night of fire and screaming. A sudden hush fell over the restaurant. It was not a gradual quieting, but a swift, collective intake of breath. Conversations faltered. The clinking of cutlery ceased. Alara looked up from the table she was clearing. The entrance was framed by the dark figures of two men, but it was the man in the center who commanded the room's absolute attention, Julian Thorne. He was known in the city's hushed circles as the architect, a man who had built an empire of shadows and fear with cold logic and surgical precision. He wore a black suit so perfectly tailored, it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hair was black, shot through with distinguished streaks of silver at the temples, and his eyes were the color of a storm gathering over a winter sea. He did not scan the room. He did not need to. His presence was a physical force, bending the atmosphere around him. Beside him stood Marcus Cole, his second in command. Marcus was broad-shouldered and solid, his face weathered but his eyes kind, in a way that seemed out of place. He was the quiet earth to Julian's volatile storm. He surveyed the room with a calm, watchful gaze, noting the exits, the patrons, the staff. His eyes briefly met Alara's, a flicker of professional assessment before moving on. Julian and Marcus moved through the silenced dining room. Patrons who had been loud and boisterous moments before now stared intently at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their own food. The host, pale and trembling slightly, led them to their usual table. It was a corner booth, offering a commanding view of the entire restaurant while keeping its occupants shrouded in shadow. A king holding court from his throne. Alara's heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. This was it. She had known he came here. She had gotten this job for the specific purpose of being in the same room as him. For 6 months she had served him coffee, replaced his silverware, and watched him conduct his dark business from that corner table, all while remaining utterly invisible to him. He never looked at her. She was just a pair of hands that brought him what he wanted. Her manager scurried over to her, his face flushed. "Vance," he hissed. "Table 7 is their table. Do not mess this up. Do not speak unless spoken to. Just take their order and get out." Alara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She watched as Julian settled into the booth, shrugging out of his jacket. The movement was fluid, economical. He placed a vintage Patek Philippe watch on the table beside his water glass, a habit she had noticed before. Everything about him was controlled, measured, deliberate. He was a man who left nothing to chance. Tonight would be different. She felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread that started in her stomach and spread to her fingertips. Her hands began to shake. She clasped them together, digging her nails into her own palms to stop the trembling. 10 years. 10 years of reliving that night. The smell of smoke and wet asphalt, the shattering of glass, the sight of a man's face, illuminated for a split second by the flashing lights of distant sirens. A face she had seen in her nightmares every night since. She could walk away. Her shift was almost over. She could clock out, go home to her empty apartment, and try again tomorrow. Or the next day. The fear was a living thing coiling in her gut, whispering that she was a fool, that this man could erase her from existence with a single careless word. But then her fingers found the locket again. She felt the dent, the small indentation where it had been pressed against the wooden slats of the closet door as she huddled in the darkness, trying not to breathe. She remembered the photo inside, her mother's smile. The weight of that memory was heavier than any fear. Justice, not revenge. Justice. The word was a prayer. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of stale bread and other people's wine. She picked up her notepad, her hand surprisingly steady now. The decision was made. The years of waiting had funneled down into this single terrifying moment. She started walking toward table 7. The few feet of polished floor felt like a mile-long bridge over a bottomless canyon. Each step was deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the other staff on her back. She could feel her manager's panicked stare. She ignored them all. Her entire world had shrunk to the man in the corner booth. Julian was speaking to Marcus in a low, quiet tone, his voice a deep rumble that did not carry. He did not look up as she approached. He simply raised a hand, a slight dismissive gesture. He was expecting a drink order. He was dismissing her before she had even arrived. This was the moment, the final insult, the casual flick of a wrist that declared her unimportant, unseen, unreal. Alara did not stop. She walked right up to the edge of the table, so close that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne and the expensive wool of his suit. She ignored the notepad in her hand. She ignored Marcus, whose eyes had narrowed in cautious curiosity. She leaned down. The movement was slow, intimate, a profound violation of the invisible wall of power that surrounded him. She brought her lips close to his ear, her own breath warm against his skin. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath with her. For a split second, she saw his jaw tighten in annoyance at her audacity. He was about to pull away, to reprimand her. But then she spoke. Her voice was not a command. It was not a threat. It was a whisper, as soft as falling snow, but it carried the weight of a collapsing building. 1412 Briarwood Lane. She felt him go still. A sudden, absolute rigidity. The muscles in his neck locked. It was an address, just a street name and a number, meaningless to anyone else in the room. But to him, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for over a decade. She didn't pull back. She pressed her advantage, letting the second part of her message sink into the sudden, shocked silence of his mind. You smell of gasoline and rain. It was a detail no one could know, a sensory ghost from a forgotten past. It was the smell that had clung to his clothes that night, the smell that had filled her hiding place as he stood just feet away, unaware of the small child holding her breath in the darkness. She straightened up slowly, her work done. She looked down at him. His face, usually the mask of cold, unassailable control, was completely blank. His storm gray eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at her. They were looking through her, at something far away, something buried deep in the graveyard of his memory. Marcus was staring at Julian, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Boss, he said, his voice low and urgent. Julian. Julian did not respond. His hand, which had been resting on his water glass, tightened. His knuckles turned white. He was no longer in the gilded cage. He was somewhere else entirely. A place of smoke and fear and a terrible, screaming noise. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot, the glass in his hand shattered. Shards fell onto the pristine white tablecloth. Water and ice spread in a dark, creeping stain. A single drop of blood welled up on his knuckle, impossibly red against his pale skin. But he did not seem to feel it. He remained frozen, his gaze locked on a memory that had just been violently resurrected. The architect's perfect world had just been breached by a waitress's whisper, and now the walls were beginning to crumble. The sharp crack of shattering crystal was the only sound in the silent restaurant. Julian Thorne did not feel the sting of the glass shards digging into his palm. He did not see the dark red wine bleeding across the pristine white tablecloth like a wound. His entire world had narrowed to the echo of a whisper. 142 Briarwood Lane, gasoline and rain. The words were not a memory. They were a key, turning a lock in a door he never knew existed inside his own mind. His gaze snapped up, searching for her, but the waitress was gone. She had vanished back into the shadows of the dining room, leaving only a storm in her wake. Marcus Cole was at his side in an instant, his movements fluid and efficient. He placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, a silent anchor in the sudden gale. With a subtle gesture, he dismissed the other men at the table. They rose without a word, their presence dissolving as they shielded their boss from the curious eyes of the other patrons. Marcus spoke in a low tone to the panicked manager, the words calm and authoritative, smoothing over the disruption with the ease of long practice. But Julian heard none of it. He was still in that frozen moment, the girl's hazel eyes locked on his, her breath a ghost against his ear. She had not been afraid. That was the most unsettling part. She had looked at him not with the terror he was used to, but with a chilling, ancient certainty. The ride back to his penthouse was a blur of city lights streaking past the tinted windows. Marcus drove, occasionally glancing at Julian in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Julian sat perfectly still, his bleeding hand wrapped in a linen napkin, his mind a maelstrom. The address was a phantom, a name with no face, yet it pulled at him. It felt like trying to remember a dream moments after waking, the details dissolving even as he grasped for them. He arrived in his home, a sterile expanse of glass and polished concrete overlooking the sleeping city. The space, usually a fortress of solitude and control, now felt like a cage. He walked to the bar, his movements stiff, and poured a whiskey over a single large cube of ice. The clink of the glass was unnervingly loud in the silence. He turned to Marcus, who stood by the door, waiting patiently. Julian's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "Find her," he commanded. "The waitress, Alara Vance." The name felt foreign on his tongue. "I want to know everything. I want every school she attended, every apartment she rented, every friend she ever had. I want to know what she fears and what she loves. Dig until you hit bedrock, and then dig deeper." He took a long swallow of the whiskey, the burn doing nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He was the architect, a man who built an empire on information in absolute control. This girl, this nobody, had just walked into his fortress and lit a fire. He needed to understand the shape of the flames before they consumed him. Marcus simply nodded. "I'll have a preliminary report by morning." He paused, his gaze steady. "Julian, are you all right?" The question was a risk, a small crack in the professional armor between them. Julian's jaw tightened. "Just find her, Marcus." The dismissal was cold, and Marcus left without another word, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click. Alone, Julian stared out at the sprawling metropolis below. He owned so much of it, could bend its will with a single phone call. Yet he felt powerless, haunted by a ghost he couldn't see. That night, sleep did not come. When he closed his eyes, he was no longer in his bed. He was standing in the dark, the smell of damp earth and something acrid, like gasoline, filling his lungs. A fine mist, or maybe it was rain, clung to his coat. He saw flashes, disjointed and violent. A woman's face, her mouth open in a scream that made no sound. The splintering of a wooden door. And eyes. A child's eyes, huge and dark with terror, peering at him through a narrow gap in a closet. They were not hazel like the waitress's. They were a deep, terrified brown, but they held the same unnerving stillness. He would bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sheets damp with a cold sweat. The images were gone as quickly as they came, leaving behind only a profound sense of dread and a question that gnawed at him. What happened on Briarwood Lane? By the next evening, Marcus had a file. It was thin, disappointingly so. Alara Vance, 24 years old, orphaned, a string of dead-end jobs, a small rented room in a rundown part of the city. She had no criminal record, no known associates of any importance, no digital footprint to speak of. She was, by all accounts, invisible, a ghost long before she had whispered in his ear. Her parents, Thomas and Sarah Vance, died in a house fire over 15 years ago, Marcus reported, his voice neutral. Ruled an accident, a faulty gas line, a house fire. The smell of smoke from his nightmares returned, stronger this time. Julian stared at the photograph in the file. It was a driver's license photo, grainy and poorly lit. Alara Vance looked tired, her dark hair pulled back, her expression blank. But her eyes were the same, piercing, knowing. An accident, Julian repeated softly, the word tasting like a lie. He felt a surge of violent impatience. The file was useless. The facts were useless. They were just bones without flesh. The truth wasn't in a file. It was with her. He knew with a certainty that frightened him that he had to see her again. He had to stand in front of her and force the answers out. He didn't wait. He didn't plan. For the first time in years, Julian Thorne acted on pure, raw impulse. He drove himself back to the gilded cage, parking his car in the shadows across the street. He watched the front entrance, but he knew she wouldn't leave that way. The staff used the back alley. He slipped out of his car and melted into the darkness, the expensive leather of his shoes silent on the grimy pavement. The alley was a narrow canyon of brick and dumpsters, smelling of stale grease and wet cardboard. A single bare bulb flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow light that made the shadows writhe. It was a world away from the warm glow of the restaurant, a place where secrets were kept and deals were made. He waited, a predator in his natural element. An hour later, the metal door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of light into the alley. Alara stepped out, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, unaware of his presence. She looked small and fragile under the harsh light, nothing like the formidable force who had shattered his composure just a night before. For a moment, he simply watched her, this girl who was a complete nobody, yet held the key to a locked room in his soul. Then he stepped out of the shadows. She didn't startle. She simply stopped, her hand on the door, and turned her head. Her eyes found him in the darkness, in a flicker of something. Not fear, but maybe resignation passed over her face. She let the door swing shut, plunging them back into the dim gloom. "I was wondering when you'd come for me," she said. Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the damp air. Julian closed the distance between them until he was only a few feet away, close enough to see the weary lines around her eyes. He towered over her, using his size, his presence, the very aura of danger he had cultivated his entire life, as a weapon. "The address," he said, his voice a low growl. "Where did you get it?" Alara didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her chin tilted up in silent defiance. "It's not something you get. It's something you carry." Her hand went to her chest, a small unconscious gesture over her heart. Like a scar, his patience, already worn thin by a sleepless night and fractured memories, was evaporating. "I don't have time for games. Who sent you? Who are you working for?" He took another step, cornering her against the cold, damp brick wall. He could smell the faint scent of dish soap and bleach on her clothes, the scent of hard work and long hours. It was so at odds with the expensive cologne and fine wool of his own suit. "Tell me who you are." A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes were filled with a pain so deep he felt he could fall into them. "You really don't remember, do you?" she whispered. The question was suave, but it landed like a physical blow. It was the same question his own mind had been screaming at him for 24 hours. She looked straight through the powerful man, the feared crime lord, and saw the broken thing he kept hidden inside. Her voice dropped even lower, filled with a sorrow that was terrifying in its intensity. "You don't remember her face, do you?" she asked, her words twisting in his gut. "My mother's?" The word struck a chord so deep within him, it was a soundless vibration of pure agony. My mother's. The phantom scream from his nightmares suddenly had a name. Sarah Vance. The woman from the file. The woman from the fire. His carefully constructed control didn't just crack. It exploded. A blind, desperate rage surged through him, a rage at her, at himself, at the gaping black hole in his memory. He reached out, his movements fast and unthinking, and his hand clamped around her wrist. The bones of her arm felt impossibly delicate in his grip. Stop it, he hissed, his face inches from hers. Stop talking. He was trying to silence her, to silence the chaos she was unleashing inside him. But the physical contact was a mistake. As his fingers tightened, his gaze fell to her face, searching for the fear he expected to see. Instead, his eyes locked onto it. A small, faded scar, a pale white line just above her left eyebrow, almost hidden by a stray strand of dark hair. It was barely visible in the dim light, but to him it blazed like a brand. The sight of it was a lightning strike to his brain. The scar acted as a key, unlocking a new fragment of the nightmare. This one more vivid, more violent than all the others. A deafening roar, a flash of unbearable heat and light, a wave of force throwing him backwards. And just before the world went black, he saw it. A small girl, no older than 8, thrown across a room by the blast, her head striking the sharp corner of a wooden doorframe. He saw the cut open above her eye. He saw her fall into the darkness. He saw the little girl from the closet. A gasp tore from Julian's throat. The memory was so real, so visceral, he felt the phantom heat on his own skin. He stumbled back, releasing her wrist as if he had been burned. The anger vanished, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping shock that left him breathless. He stared at Alara, at the woman standing before him, but he no longer saw a waitress. He saw the little girl. He saw the eyes from the closet. He saw the scar he had just given her. His carefully ordered world had not just fractured. It had ceased to exist. The alley air was cold, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his skin. Julian Thorne stumbled back, his hand dropping from Alara's wrist as if her skin had burned him. The small, faded scar above her eye was a brand, a symbol seared into a part of his mind he could not access. It was a lock, and she held the only key. For a man who built his life on absolute control, the sensation was horrifying. It felt like falling. He watched her stand there, unflinching, her gaze a mixture of ancient pain and chilling resolve. The quiet waitress from the gilded cage held a power over him that entire criminal organizations had failed to achieve. His breath came in ragged bursts. He needed to reclaim the moment, to put the world back on its axis. He pulled out his phone, his fingers surprisingly unsteady as he dialed. The call connected on the first ring. Julian did not bother with a greeting. His voice was a raw, strained command. Marcus, my location. Now. He hung up without waiting for a reply. He looked back at Alara, who had not moved. She simply watched him, her expression unchanging, as if she knew every step of this dance before it began. She was not a victim in an alley. She was a ghost, patiently waiting for a debt to be collected. Within 5 minutes, a sleek black sedan pulled silently to the curb at the alley's mouth. Marcus Cole stepped out, his broad frame a study in calm efficiency. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. Julian, looking more undone than Marcus had seen him in 15 years, and the small, dark-haired woman who stood opposite him, radiating an unnerving stillness. Marcus's eyes held a question, but he did not ask it. He simply waited. Bring her to the penthouse, Julian said, his voice low and tight. He did not look at Alara as he spoke, instead staring at the brick wall beside her. Do not harm her. Do not let her out of your sight. Marcus gave a short, affirmative nod. It was an unusual order, but Julian's commands were not meant to be understood, only obeyed. Julian turned and walked to his own car, parked further down the street, getting in without a backward glance. He could feel her eyes on his back the entire way. Marcus approached Alara. He was an imposing man, but his eyes were not cold like Julian's. They were watchful and held a trace of weariness. Miss, he said, his voice a low rumble, if you will please come with me. Alara felt her own heartbeat, a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. For 10 years, this was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind. She had imagined screaming, fighting, being dragged away. But now that it was here, she felt none of that. There was only a profound and terrifying calm. She had set the pieces in motion, and now she would see the game to its end. She gave a small nod and walked toward the open car door, her steps measured and certain. The ride through the city was silent. Marcus drove with practiced ease, his eyes occasionally flicking to her in the rearview mirror. Ilara stared out the window, watching the glittering towers of the financial district slide past. The city was a web of light and shadow, and at its center was a man who lived in a glass tower, convinced he was untouchable. The penthouse was on the 67th floor. The elevator ascended in a smooth, silent rush that made her ears pop. When the doors opened, they revealed not a hallway, but the apartment itself. It was less a home and more a statement. The floors were polished gray concrete. The furniture was stark, black and chrome, arranged with geometric precision. And 3 of the 4 walls were just glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that presented the sprawling city below like a conquered territory. The air smelled of clean glass and a faint, expensive cologne. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. There was only a long, heavily stocked bar against the one solid wall, its bottles arranged like soldiers in perfect rows. Julian was standing by the window, his back to them, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He did not turn when they entered. Marcus stopped just inside the doorway. "She's here," he said quietly. "Leave us," Julian commanded, his voice flat. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze moving from Julian's rigid back to Ilara's calm face. He gave her one last, searching look before nodding and letting the door click shut behind him, leaving the 2 of them alone in the vast, silent room. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the city far below. Finally, Julian turned. His face was a mask of control, but his storm-gray eyes were turbulent. He had tried to piece together the fragments in his mind, the flashes of fire and fear her words had unlocked. But they remained just that, fragments, meaningless and maddening. "You have my attention," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "What is it you want? Money? Is that what this is about?" Ilara ignored his questions. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her worn waitress shoes silent on the cold floor. She stopped at a low-glass coffee table that sat between 2 severe black leather sofas. She did not look at the view or the expensive furniture. She looked only at him. Her own heart was a metronome, counting down the final seconds of a life spent waiting. She had thought she might be afraid. Instead, she felt a clarity so sharp it was painful. "It was raining that night," she began, her voice soft, yet it carried across the cavernous space with perfect clarity. "A cold spring rain. I remember the sound of it against the window in my bedroom." Julian flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He wanted to order her to stop, but the words caught in his throat. A part of him, a dark and terrified part, needed to hear this. "I was supposed to be asleep," Ilara continued, her eyes distant, looking at a scene only she could see. "But my parents were talking downstairs. My father's voice was calm. He was a journalist. He was always calm. He was explaining something. Then I heard another voice, one I didn't recognize. It was low and angry." She paused and her gaze locked onto his. "It was your voice." Julian's hand tightened around his glass, the knuckles turning white. A sharp pain lanced through his temple. Smoke. The smell of wet wool. A woman's scream, cut short. The images were like lightning flashes in a dark room, illuminating nothing but chaos. "I was 7 years old," Ilara said, her tone never wavering. It was the voice of a news anchor reporting a distant tragedy, utterly devoid of her own agony. "I crept out of my room and hid at the top of the stairs. I saw you. You were younger then. Your hair was all black. You were shouting at my father, telling him to give you his files. He refused." She took a breath. "Then I heard a loud crash. My mother screamed. I ran and hid in the hall closet behind the heavy winter coats. I pulled the door shut, leaving just a tiny crack to see through." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I heard them talking about what to do now. Your voice and another man's. You sounded panicked. You said it wasn't supposed to happen like this. The other man said it didn't matter. He said to finish it, to make it look like an accident. Julian took an involuntary step back, his face pale. The phantom smell of gasoline filled his nostrils, acrid and sickening. He could feel a pressure building behind his eyes, a dam of forgotten memories threatening to burst. He wanted to shout, to deny it, but his throat was sealed tight. I squeezed my eyes shut, Alara whispered, and for the first time a tremor entered her voice. I buried my face in my mother's old coat. I could still smell her perfume on it. I heard you moving around the house. I heard the sound of liquid splashing. Then, the silence. A terrible, heavy silence that had felt louder than all the shouting. I waited. I counted to 100 over and over. I was so afraid. I thought you had left. She took a small, shuddering breath, the first crack in her placid armor. But then the floorboards outside the closet creaked. You were standing right there. I saw your shoes through the crack at the bottom of the door. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I thought you would open it. I thought you would find me. Julian's glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the concrete floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the sterile quiet. He didn't notice. He was staring at her, his mind a whirlwind of static and horror. A closet, a child's terrified eyes peering through a crack. The image flared in his mind, so vivid he felt he could reach out and touch the splintered wood. You didn't open the door, Alara said, her voice regaining its chilling composure. You turned and walked away. A few seconds later, the world turned into fire and noise. She looked at the scar above her own eyebrow. A piece of the door frame hit me. When I woke up, firefighters were carrying me out. The house was gone, and my parents, they were gone too. The story hung in the air between them, an indictment more powerful than any legal document. Julian was breathing heavily now, his carefully constructed world reduced to rubble around him. He knew it was true. His body remembered the trauma his mind had buried. The blank space in his memory was not empty. It was a crater, and she had just led him to its edge. You took everything from me, Alara said, her voice flat and final. My home, my family, my childhood. But you missed something. You left one thing behind. She reached into the pocket of her simple black trousers. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She pulled out a small object. It was a silver locket, heart-shaped, tarnished with age and bearing a small, distinct dent on one side. She held it in her palm for a moment before placing it gently on the glass table. The soft click of metal on glass was the loudest sound Julian had ever heard. He stared at it. The dented locket. He had seen it before. In his nightmares. It would fall from a woman's neck, spinning in slow motion through air thick with smoke. With a steady hand, Alara reached out and opened the locket's clasp. Inside, nestled on one side, was a tiny, faded photograph. A smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm around a small, gap-toothed girl with dark hair. The girl was Alara. The woman was her mother. This was her face, Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. The one you couldn't remember. Julian moved toward the table as if pulled by an invisible force. He leaned over, his eyes fixed on the photograph. The woman's face, the child's face, the dented locket, the smell of rain and gasoline, the sound of a scream, the heat of the fire on his skin. It was not a memory, it was a resurrection. The dam inside his head did not break, it exploded. 15 years of suppressed horror came rushing back in a single tidal wave. He was there again, on Briarwood Lane. He saw the journalist, a brave man refusing to be intimidated. He saw the struggle, his partner losing control, the accidental fatal blow. He saw the woman, Alara's mother, run into the room, her face a mask of terror. He saw the locket fall from her neck as she collapsed beside her husband. He heard his own voice, young and panicked, arguing with his mentor, Silas Croft, over the phone. Silas's cold voice giving the final damning order. No witnesses, Julian. Burn it all. He remembered splashing the gasoline, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the can. He remembered seeing the flicker of movement from the hall closet and freezing, a cold dread washing over him. He had almost opened it, but the fear of what he might find and the desperate need to just be gone, had made him turn away. He remembered the spark from the faulty wiring he'd crossed, the deafening roar of the gas line igniting, and a wave of searing heat throwing him across the lawn. He remembered the pain, and then a welcome, crushing blackness. But what returned with the most force, what buckled his knees and stole the air from his lungs, was not the fire or the violence. It was the guilt. The soul-crushing, absolute guilt he had felt in that split second before the explosion took his memory. The guilt of a young man who had followed an order that led to the destruction of a family. The guilt he had buried under an empire of concrete, steel, and fear. Julian Thorne, the architect, the untouchable ruler of the city's underworld, fell. He collapsed to his knees on the cold concrete floor, his hands flying to his head as if he could physically hold the fracturing pieces of his mind together. A sound tore itself from his throat, a raw, agonized noise that was not a word or a scream, but the sound of a man's soul breaking in two. He finally remembered it all, not just the event, but the crushing weight of what he had done, a weight he had unknowingly carried for over a decade. The sound that tore from Julian Thorne's throat was not human. It was the raw, grating noise of a soul being ripped apart, an agony that had been sealed away for more than a decade. He was on his knees on the polished concrete floor, his hands clamped over his ears as if he could physically block the memories now roaring through him. The sterile penthouse, once a monument to his control, had become a torture chamber of his own making. The city lights glittered beyond the glass, a silent, indifferent audience to his complete collapse. Alara stood perfectly still. Her work was done. For 10 years she had imagined this moment. She had pictured his arrogance shattering, his cold eyes filling with the horror he had inflicted. She thought it would bring her a sense of peace, a quiet finality. But watching him break on the floor, she felt nothing. There was no satisfaction, only a hollow echo in the space where her childhood used to be. The locket on the table between them seemed to absorb all the light in the room, a tiny, silver black hole of memory. Marcus Cole, ever the loyal soldier, took a hesitant step forward, his instinct to protect his boss warring with the scene before him. But Alara's gaze, tired yet sharp as broken glass, flickered to him. It was not a threat, but a command. Stay back. This was not his moment. This belonged to her, and to the man gasping for air on the floor. Julian's ragged breath slowly began to even out, each one a painful shudder. He lowered his hands, his knuckles white. He did not look at her. He stared at the floor, at the reflection of a man he no longer recognized. His voice, when it finally came, was a wrecked whisper, stripped of all its authority. It wasn't supposed to be like that. He swallowed, the sound loud in the unnerving quiet. The order, it came from Silas Croft. The name was spoken like a curse, something foul he had to spit out. He was my mentor, the man who taught me everything, the one who made me. He still couldn't look at her, his confession directed at the floor, at the ghosts only he could see. Your father, he was a journalist, a good one, too good. Julian's words were fractured, pieced together from the wreckage of his memory. He was investigating Silas's shipping routes, his connections. He was getting too close to unraveling everything. The order was to retrieve his files, to scare him, to make him stop. A tremor ran through his broad shoulders. No one was supposed to get hurt. We were just supposed to take his research and leave a message. He finally painfully lifted his head. His storm gray eyes, usually so cold and commanding, were now flooded with a deep, bottomless ocean of guilt. They were the eyes of a damned man. There was a struggle. Your mother, she tried to call for help. It all went wrong so fast. The lamp fell. I remember the smell of the hand leak, the spark. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the faint stubble on his jaw. Silas found me in the hospital. He told me it was a tragic accident, a fire. He said I was lucky to be alive. He helped me bury it. He helped me forget her face. His voice cracked on the last words. Alara listened, her posture unwavering. So there was a name, Silas Croft. It wasn't just a faceless organization. It was a man who had used a younger, more malleable Julian as his tool. The knowledge didn't change the past, but it clarified the future. She had spent half her life fueled by a singular image, Julian's face in the firelight. Now a new face began to form in the shadows behind him. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Julian flinched, his body tensing as if expecting a sentence to be carried out. He thought she would scream at him, strike him, perhaps even end him. He would have welcomed it. Instead, her voice cut through the air, as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "I don't want your apology, Julian." He looked up, his expression a mask of confusion. Marcus, standing by the bar, watched with utter bafflement. "I have spent 10 years dreaming of your ruin," she continued, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I thought that meant wanting you dead, but I was a child then. I understand things differently now." She walked around the glass table, closing the distance between them until she stood directly before him. He was a king on his knees before a waitress. "Killing you would be too simple. It's an ending. I don't want an ending. I want a reckoning." Julian stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words through the fog of his guilt. "Your mentor, Silas Croft, built an empire on secrets and fear," she said, her hazel eyes boring into his. "He used you, his most promising student, his architect, to design its strongest walls. You were his finest tool, and now you will be my weapon." The power in the room had shifted completely. It flowed not from the man with the billion-dollar enterprise, but from the quiet young woman with nothing but a dented silver locket to her name. "You are going to help me," she stated. It was not a request. "You will use your intelligence, your resources, your position. You will find every weakness in Silas's network. You will exploit every dirty secret, every fragile alliance. You will not stop until his entire world has turned to ash. You will tear it all down, piece by piece, from the inside out. And when he has nothing left, you will make sure he knows that the ghost of Briarwood Lane was the one who sent you." This was her justice. Not a bullet, but the complete and total annihilation of a legacy carried out by its most celebrated creation. She would not make Julian a martyr. She would make him the instrument of a far greater destruction. A sharp, insistent buzz cut through the tense silence. Marcus's phone, for us. He glanced at it, his brow furrowed, then looked to Julian for permission. Julian gave a slight, exhausted nod. Marcus answered, his voice a low rumble. "Cole." He listened, his broad frame growing more rigid by the second. His gaze darted from his boss on the floor to the woman standing over him. A new, more immediate danger was entering the room through the phone line. The conversation was brief. Marcus ended the call without a goodbye. "Julian," he said, his voice grim, "we have a problem." He took a step away from the bar, his eyes fixed on Alara. "Word is out on the street. It's moving fast. Silas has heard the whispers." Julian's head snapped up, the haze of his guilt momentarily pierced by alarm. "He knows," Marcus continued, his tone urgent. "He's heard rumors about a survivor, a ghost from Briarwood Lane. He's getting nervous. He thinks someone from his past is coming back to haunt him." The air in the penthouse grew thick and cold. The distant city hum seemed to die away. "He's calling in old markers, Julian, activating assets from a generation ago. People even we don't know about. Loyalists from before your time." Marcus's eyes were deadly serious. "His orders are clean and simple. Find any loose ends connected to the at night and cut them. Permanently." The unsaid threat was a physical presence in the room. Ilara was the loose end. She was the ghost. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear touched her heart. Her plan had been about psychological warfare, about turning Julian's power against its source. She had never accounted for the old monster, fighting back so quickly, so directly. The words were barely out of Marcus's mouth when the world exploded. A sound like a dry branch snapping, magnified 1,000 times, cracked through the penthouse. It was immediately followed by the percussive implosion of glass. The massive floor-to-ceiling window pane, just to Alara's left, erupted inwards. A beautiful, terrifying spiderweb of fractures bloomed from a single point before the entire sheet of tempered glass disintegrated into a blizzard of glittering shards. Alara cried out, throwing an arm up to shield her face as the air filled with a storm of crystal shrapnel. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. She saw the hole in the glass. She saw the city lights blur behind it. Before the first piece of glass had even struck the floor, Julian moved. The broken, kneeling man was gone. In his place was a predator, a creature of pure, lethal instinct. All the years of training, all the violence he had managed and controlled, it all surged to the surface in a single explosive moment. He launched himself from his knees, covering the distance between them in a single, desperate bound. He didn't reach for her. He crashed into her, his body a solid wall of muscle and intent. His arms wrapped around her torso, pulling her tight against him as he drove them both away from the exposed window. They hit the concrete floor hard. The impact stole the air from Alara's lungs, a painful jolt that radiated through her entire body. She felt the sharp sting of glass shards digging into her back and arms. A split second later, another whip crack sound echoed through the room. A chunk of white plaster and wiring exploded from the wall right where her head had been moments before. Dust and debris rained down on them. Julian's body was a heavy, living shield over hers. His weight was immense, pressing her down into the cold floor, pinning her amid the debris of his shattered penthouse. She could feel the frantic, hammering beat of his heart against her shoulder blade, a wild rhythm of terror and adrenaline. He was breathing hard, his face buried in her hair, the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the acrid smell of dust and destruction. More shots peppered the room, thudding into the thick upholstery of the sofa, shattering a marble lamp, punching clean holes through the far wall. Through the chaos, his voice was a low, desperate growl in her ear, a command born not of power but of pure, primal fear. Don't move! The world was a storm of noise and sharp edges. Dust from the shattered window filled Alara's lungs, tasting like concrete and fear. Julian's weight was a solid, crushing presence on top of her. For a split second, her mind flashed to the closet, to the feeling of being small and trapped. But this was different. This weight was a shield, not a threat. The hard planes of his chest pressed against her back, and one of his hands was protectively cupped over her head. Another gunshot rang out, followed by the sickening thud of a bullet embedding itself in a heavy oak bookshelf across the room. Splinters of wood rained down near them. Julian's voice was a low growl in her ear, devoid of his usual commanding tone. It was pure primal instinct. He was no longer the architect of a criminal empire. He was just a man in the path of a bullet. "Stay down," he ordered, his breath hot against her skin. She could feel the rapid, heavy beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. It felt just as frantic as her own. Marcus was shouting from the hallway, his voice tight with urgency. "Julian, we have to move. Now." A moment later, Marcus appeared at the edge of the living room, low to the ground, his face a mask of grim determination. His eyes met Julian's, a silent conversation passing between them in a heartbeat. Julian shifted his weight, moving with a speed that startled her. He grabbed her arm, not with the brutal force he'd used in the alley, but with a firm, guiding grip. "On my count, we go for the hall." Alara's mind struggled to catch up. Her plan, 10 years in the making, had accounted for every psychological weakness, every historical detail. It had never accounted for this. It had never accounted for sniper fire or for the man who ruined her life becoming her only chance of survival. 3, Julian counted, his voice low. 2. He looked at her, his storm gray eyes locking onto hers. In that fraction of a second, she saw not a monster, but a man facing the consequences of a past he had only just reclaimed. 1, they moved. The world became a blur of motion. Julian half dragged, half pushed her behind him, keeping his body between her and the shattered wall of windows. They scrambled into the hallway as another shot whizzed through the space they had just occupied, striking the marble floor with a sharp crack. Marcus was already at the service exit, holding the heavy steel door open. "Garage level, go," he commanded. The air in the stairwell was cold and smelled of dust and metal. Their footsteps echoed loudly on the concrete steps. Alara's legs felt like lead, her lungs burning. Julian never let go of her arm. His grip was an anchor in the chaos. Down in the subterranean garage, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and coal cement. A black sedan sat waiting, its engine already humming. Marcus slid into the driver's seat as Julian pushed Alara into the back, climbing in after her. He slammed the door shut just as the heavy garage gate began to rumble open. The tires squealed in protest as Marcus accelerated, whipping the car out into the dim light of the city's underbelly. Elara pressed herself against the cold leather seat, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. Her entire body trembled, an aftershock of adrenaline. Julian sat beside her, silent, staring straight ahead. His knuckles were white where he gripped the seat in front of him. The invincible Julian Thorne looked shaken. He looked human. They drove for nearly an hour, leaving the dense grid of the city behind. The towering skyscrapers gave way to sprawling suburbs, and then to dark, winding country roads flanked by tall, skeletal trees. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and Marcus's occasional quiet direction into his phone. Elara watched Julian from the corner of her eye. The hard lines of his face were cast in shadow and flickering light from the passing street lamps. She had imagined this man's downfall 1,000 times. She had pictured him on his knees, broken and defeated. She had not pictured sitting beside him in the dark, their shoulders occasionally brushing, sharing the same suffocating air of fear. He had shielded her. The thought kept circling in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. Why? Was it guilt or something else? Something she could not afford to name. Finally, Marcus turned onto a long, unpaved gravel driveway. The headlights cut through a thicket of pine trees, revealing a small, unassuming house made of dark wood and stone. It was isolated, nestled deep within the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. "We're here," Marcus announced, his voice tired. "It's clean. No one knows about this place but me." He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pine needles. Julian finally moved, turning his head to look at her. His face was unreadable in the darkness. "Let's go inside," he said. His voice was flat, exhausted. The safe house was sparse but functional. It smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. A simple stone fireplace dominated the main room, which held a worn sofa, 2 armchairs, and a small wooden table. A compact kitchen was visible through an archway. It was a place designed for hiding, for waiting. It was a cage of a different sort. Marcus checked the perimeter, his movements efficient and practiced.